come up? You want to be on the camera?
How does Margot make pie crust?
For the dessert, I was really like racking my brain on how I was going to approach it and like gave it a lot of thought of like, what do I want this Thanksgiving? Like what is to me the best version of Thanksgiving dessert? We already know that pumpkin pie is out. It was never on the table, literally or figuratively. It's not for me. So that's out. And then I was thinking about apples, and then I did like I was like, okay, I'll do like a Kuhl tart with like a shortbread crust and like a crumble tart, like whatever. I went through the motions, I did the testing, I made the thing, I ate the thing. It was good, it was fine. And at the end of the day, all I wanted was a really gorgeous and extremely simple, like apple tart. A small, like beautiful, crispy, tart, tender piece of apple with like a flaky crust is all A, you have room for, and B, all you really need. And so for me, it's gotta be like a beautiful, simple apple tart. Good night. All right, friends, pie crust. We are gonna make one batch, which is 2 rounds, and that's because we're gonna make 2 tarts. We're gonna make 2 perfect apple tarts. If you were making an apple pie, absolutely go ahead and still make this crust and still make it today. I'm gonna get my plastic wrap out because I've learned from my mistakes. In this bowl, 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour, scoop and level, a teaspoon of kosher salt, and then 2 teaspoons of sugar. This is our ice water for when we need it. I'm just gonna let that do its thing. And to that, I'm gonna add 2.5 sticks of unsalted butter. You don't need to use like your fanciest butter. I've made this crust with the worst butter you can buy and also the best butter you can buy. And both versions work. Yeah, everybody in there. Everybody in the pool. All right, and now comes the fun part where we mix with our hands. Again, I am not a fan of using machinery when I can avoid it, and I think that pie crust is really wonderful when you make it by hand. There are a lot of great methods out there that involve shaving butter into thin shards, grating it on a box grater, but to me, I've never had this fail me. I've never wished it was flakier. I've never wished it were different. I think it's perfect. And it's also the easiest. It's about as much work as I want to do. So basically we are smushing the butter into the flour, and this is gonna do the thing that makes the dough flaky. So already you can see that it like kind of is flaky-ish looking. It doesn't look like a uniform dough. This isn't smooth. It's very dry looking. There's bits of butter that are larger. There's some that are smaller. Effectively, like, that's okay. We don't want this to be too uniform, which is again why we're doing it by hand and not in a machine. And this is as much as I'm gonna mix it right now. And you can see, like, again, some larger pieces of butter that I've smushed with my hands to make them very flat. If you're making scones or biscuits or pie crust, like, it all kind of starts in the same way. If flakiness is your objective. All right, I've got a 1/4 cup of that ice water in here, and then I'm gonna do a tablespoon of vinegar. I'm eyeballing it. I think I know what a tablespoon is now. That's like the least cool flex. All right, and I'm gonna drizzle this over the top. I kind of like to start with half of it and shake the bowl. And then shake it so that any dry bits kind of come to the top. And this does a lot of the heavy lifting for you before you have to use your hands. I think that whoever decided that ice water should be the gold standard for pie crust is a real genius who probably was cooking in a really hot kitchen. I'm gonna dump this whole thing out onto the counter. You could use a cutting board, but I like to just do it directly on the work surface. And so I'm just going to basically gather this into a mass. I'm gonna cut it in half and actually put it right on top, press it. This is effectively kneading it. Any dry spots on the top get incorporated, and that's it. So it looks like an absolute disaster right now, and if you tried to roll this out, you probably wouldn't have much luck, but through the magic of hydration, the word of the day. What? I'm hydrated, this dough is gonna get hydrated. As this dough sits, everything will sort of like blossom and puff up and come together. Like the best way I could describe it is like A flour that is wilted, if you put it in water, it perks up. Same thing with flour. Like it's dry and it feels like shrivelly and crumbly, and then you add water to it and it plumps up. That's it. Pat your dough into the shape that you want it. So if I were doing rectangular galettes, I would honestly just pack it like this into a rectangle, but I'm gonna do round for no reason other than I like circles more than rectangles. Okay, 2 little princes going to sleep. Can I see the paper? Yeah. Lines. This episode of Home Movies is brought to you by State Farm. I hope those people have car insurance. State Farm offers some surprisingly great rates on car insurance, and that's why today I'm going to offer you some surprisingly fantastic tips on how to host Thanksgiving. Ask people to bring ice, because unless you have even if you have an ice maker, I feel like you're going to run out of ice, and that is something that when you need, nothing else can replace it. Invest in a few folding chairs, because I know that I only have 6 seats at this table, but having these folding chairs that slide to the back of my credenza, you can store in a closet, are so helpful for additional seats. A thing that you should be also having on hand are plenty of disposable containers. And these can be like plastic Tupperwares or like to-go style containers. You can order them on the internet from restaurant supply stores, but you wanna get the food out of your fridge. You want some leftovers, but you don't want all the leftovers. And sending people home with like a little pint of mashed potatoes is such a beautiful gift. So hopefully these tips provide a little coverage for you on the big day, just like State Farm provides coverage for you every day. Like a good neighbor that you're obviously going to invite to your Thanksgiving, State Farm is there. Not literally your Thanksgiving, but figuratively. Go to statefarm.com for a quote today. I have not committed to galette or tart as the name for this, so just assume that I mean one if I end up calling it the other. Okay, so each tart is gonna require 1 crust, so that recipe made 2. To me, part of why this tastes so good is because I think this pie crust recipe is so amazing. So if you don't wanna make your own crust, I would actually recommend using something like store-bought puff pastry for this. Each one is gonna take about 2 pounds-ish of apples. You could also use pears. You could use a mix of apples and pears. So I'm gonna weigh out about 4 pounds of apples. Again, I kind of just bought a bunch because they're in season now. I like varying sizes and shapes and colors because I feel like they make for a really nice like end product, but big apple, small apple, whatever. Big apple, we live there. All right, so I'm lining these with parchment paper before I do anything else. Well, I did put flour on the counter. Do you remember yesterday when I was like, it will hydrate and become plumper and fluffier and more supple? And you can see that that's already the case. Like you can even smush it between your fingers and it stays together. There's no dry spots, no bits of flour. This is like a beautiful, smooth, and pliable pie crust or tart dough or galette crust. So I'm gonna roll this out into like a pretty thin disc. I like to flip mine back and forth. I think that prevents sticking. But also if you have any cracks and holes like that, you can literally just patch them back up together. Pie crust is so much more forgiving than I think people think it is. And I get when people say like, oh, mine has cracked and mine feels this way, or mine didn't stick together or broke. Like that happens to me all the time. When you're brushing it with flour, you are doing a little bit. I don't ever want you to do more less frequently. I want you to do a small amount frequently. If you feel more comfortable rolling this out onto a piece of parchment, that works too. I find that the parchment gets really slippery and I don't like doing that. So you don't need a perfect circle, obviously, or if you were going for a rectangle, you could do that. But you don't want it so thin that you can't pick it up. But just know that as a pie crust or tart crust bakes, it does puff up a little bit. So erring on the side of thinner is always, I think, a pretty good idea. It should be even, and a really good way of doing that is just literally running your hand across the surface of it. You'll be able to tell if there's thicker parts. I think most people tend to put a lot of emphasis on the center of the crust and they roll from the middle, which means the ends and the edges tend to be thicker than they ought to be. So that's why these pins are actually shaped this way. So you can kind of apply even pressure throughout. When we roll like this, we tend to just press down and it only becomes thin where our hands are. So if you keep your hands like this, you're gonna get a lot more even of a roll. That looks good to me. I'm gonna transfer it to this piece of parchment. And I'll do that by rolling it up. So I put the first one in the fridge because I'm like nervous that it's gonna get too warm, so that freaks me out. I feel like historically in this kitchen, pie crust always gets too warm for me to work with, so I just put it in the fridge. And then we'll roll out our second one. I'm going to melt 1 stick of butter. We're gonna melt that and then we're gonna brown it. For the apples, we're not gonna really do much to them other than cut them because everything's gonna happen after the fact. Oh, so I'm gonna turn my oven on. Wow, things are really happening. 375, please. And then I'm gonna mix together a 1/2 cup of light brown sugar. You could use granulated sugar if you want. I like light brown sugar with apples. And then a 1/2 teaspoon of ground cinnamon. I don't really use cinnamon when I bake that often. I feel like I put it in like carrot cake and when I'm making rice pudding, cinnamon rolls, obviously. But because this apple tart is so simple, there was something really nice about a little bit of cinnamon there. And when I eat it, it's very cinnamon toast crunchy to me. If you were like a real cinnamon head, you could add a little bit more, but I find that like a whisper of cinnamon is adequate. It's also a good opportunity to add like ground ginger or maybe cardamom or something else if you are cinnamon fatigued or you just like are really into warm spices. Anything would work in this brown sugar mixture. You hear that butter? Isn't that sweet? So notice how it gets quieter as it browns. The sounds you're hearing as it's browning at first, why it's so loud, is because it's the water evaporating. All right, now we're gonna cut the apples. There's a few ways to do this tart. If you wanted to do rounds, you could. And you don't really have to worry about the core. Someone's definitely gonna be like, apple seeds are poisonous, but you have to eat so many apple seeds. Even if you ate all of these tarts yourself, I don't think it would do it. You wanna go thin, but not too thin. This isn't like, you know, we're not looking for paper thin layers. And to me, like the irregularity of apple slice will make this also beautiful. This one's a pretty one. Huge advocate for mixing apples. I love an Arkansas Black. I love a Macoun. This is a good one.
Wow.
A good apple is really good. This is probably gonna be the last apple. I said 4 pounds, but it might be closer to 3.5 pounds because we're using the whole apple. 4 pounds if you're cutting the core away, 3.5 pounds if you're using the whole apple. If you were gonna cut the apple off the core for the same tart, I would cut it like that. Arguably easier than what I just did. No matter what, you're slicing it thinly. Now we assemble. And like the assembly part is very easy and should not give you like any stress at all. The vibe here is extremely casual. Each one has its own little sheet pan. We're ready to go. We're not gonna touch it after the fact. And if you want to arrange these apples in any sort of like cool way, you can. It's kind of like you can tuck things in like an edible arrangement. You want like a pretty even layer, I would say, is like my piece of advice. But don't overthink it, you know? Cool. That feels good. I'm not like measuring them out exactly, and I've left about 1 inch to 2 inches, depending, of border, just to make sure that I can have crust to fold it up, which will also keep like the juices inside, help the apples cook quickly and more evenly. While I left the seeds in, you do want to make sure that any stems are out. I just found a stem. You just pluck it out. Cool. Unfortunately for me, I can't find my pastry brush. If anyone sees it, let me know. But I am gonna just spoon the butter and sprinkle the sugar over, and then I'll use my hands for the egg wash, because what else am I gonna do? If you're nervous about this, you can definitely divide both the butter and the sugar evenly using measuring tools or a scale, but again, I don't think this deserves that level of fussiness, and you can probably just eyeball it. I'm just whisking it to break it up to make the egg wash. I'll whisk like a splash of water. So to fold the edges up, we're gonna use that parchment paper to kind of just fold it up. In all of its lopsided, sort of uneven glory, we celebrate the apple galette. It's not meant to be perfect. It's not meant to be even. It's not meant to be pristine. Each one looks different. That's also nice. But there's no expectation that it should be any certain way. Except for evenly golden brown, which I'll get to. It's weird how when I was making it, it was a tart, and then when I started folding it, it became a galette. This is kind of gross. I will admit, I am sorry. I do not have a brush. Your fingers are the best tool if you don't have one, so.
Nature's brush.
Yeah, that's what they call your fingers, nature's brush. If you don't have a hairbrush, use your fingers. If you don't have a pastry brush, use your fingers. It's Thanksgiving. I don't have a pastry brush. Things just kind of disappear in my house, like a sock, but it's a pastry brush. Yeah, a lot of people just straight up don't have one. They're like, why would I need that? But if you have a paintbrush that you've never used in your possession, now's a good time to use it. So yeah, I'm using regular sugar because I'm assuming that everybody just has like a jar of regular sugar hanging out in their house, or a box of it at least. If you don't, I would use brown sugar or demerara sugar, AKA sugar in the raw, and just like a nice little sprinkle of salt on top. Because we love salty with our sweet. This one's like not as pretty as this one. There's always one. Anyway, into the oven. Cool, so those are gonna go in. I'm gonna set a timer for 35 minutes. Ooh. Stunning, gorgeous. So see how they're deeply browned? There's some caramelization on the outside, and that's okay. But there's like bubbling here, and that's from the apples. This to me is perfect. I'm thrilled to get to eat this. Apples plus butter plus sugar plus a crunchy, crispy crust made with butter is perfect. At the end of the meal, I'm generally so full anyway that like to make any sort of to-do about dessert is like, I don't have time for it. And I think that having a perfect little slice of apple tart with some Amaro, maybe some vanilla ice cream, you cannot ask for a finer end to this meal. You want someone to be like, I'm full, and then like look at this tart and be like, oh, well, I could have like a sliver of the apple tart, and then they always come back for more.